I'm going to, let me just open up my chat thing here. I want to get a bit of a different. Oh shoot, I'm gonna. I was getting, okay. All right, before we get started, I just want to, I'm gonna paste something into the chat right now. A number of churches and groups are already working on a number of these issues, and I just wanted to highlight an event that's coming up on April 8th that the United Church of Canada is hosting. So there's a link to a flyer there, and so I'll just let, oops, I did that. I will, sorry, post that again, make sure everybody gets it. Okay. Good. So, okay. Well, I think as folks are still logging on, I'll just do a couple little housekeeping things. I've got someone, if you haven't already, get yourself on mute. That would be most helpful. Questions are going to be welcomed. They'll be able to be put into the chat function in Zoom or into the comments at if you're watching on the YouTube stream. So that'll come later. We're going to try to keep this event hopefully within about a 90-minute time frame. So I would just be mindful of your questions, pay attention to the speakers. If they've sort of answered what you're wondering, then make sure we give chance for other questions to come up. What else did I have here? And then before we close, we'll allow each speaker to have some closing comments at the end. So I should say that the motivation for this event was really just a desire for greater understanding and how to address what I think most of us can call unnecessary expressions of struggle due to poverty. I think anyone that digs into this will quickly find a diversity of perspectives. And so I thought it important at the beginning to already acknowledge the diversity gathered here, even in those who have agreed to sponsor this event with Mennonite Church Manitoba, Mennonite Central Committee Manitoba as institutions that have tended to focus on congregational charity as a response and nonprofit organizations. We also had Anglican and United Church sponsorship, both of whom have nationally made public commitments in support of a guaranteed personal income. And as I mentioned, there is some an information in the chat there about an upcoming event, as well as a new group, Treaty 1 Christians for Socialism, whose work at this point has focused on trying to understand and name some of the structural realities that the church should be aware of in addressing issues of justice. So all that to say, I think we have quite a diversity represented here that I hope can all benefit from this time. My name is David Drieger. I'm one of the ministers at First Mennonite Church here in Winnipeg. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we gather on various territories within Canada in this format. I am participating from Treaty 1 territory that include the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. I also want to begin by that in acknowledging the land and the treaties, we also acknowledge not only the inherited legacies of the Indian Act, fraught treaty negotiations and residential schools, but also the legacies of slavery and anti-Blackness, of oppressive and violent racism, the criminalizing of poverty, endangering of sex workers, as well as those struggling with addictions and mental well-being. I acknowledge these injustices named and the many others unnamed because I think they should haunt any talk about wealth, justice, and faith as voices that need to be heeded and attended to. For those of us who are Christians, we can perhaps call such haunting an invocation for the presence and leading of the Holy Spirit. So in gathering this way, it's perhaps unexceptional to say that conversations around religion, politics, and economics can be both difficult and divisive. And so I thought it might be worth taking a moment to see if we can tease out a little of what that problem might be, particularly as a church, given that I have not tasked Ms. Gazan or Mr. Clark to speak theologically on behalf of the church. But I hope that we can find clarity on two things. First, of all issues, the Bible seems most consistent and thorough on matters of justice in relation to poverty and inequality. It doesn't much matter where you look, whether gazing out over the abundance of creation, finding equitable distribution of food in the 40 years in the wilderness, following the laws for fair use of land in Israel, hearing the prophets condemn unjust gain, Jesus proclaiming good news to the poor, telling parables of people complaining to officials in order to get fair treatment, business owners paying an equal wage regardless of how long someone worked. There is Paul, who pleads with churches to allocate their wealth fairly. James, who rails against the oppression caused by the rich. That Christians are to embrace and seek justice in the face of poverty is clear. So I hope that is one point of clarity. Second, I want to suggest that I think it should be clear that the church cannot avoid being political. Now here I am, of course, speaking of matters larger than partisan or party politics. Politics, broadly speaking, I think, is that system or structure that attempts to account for everything and everyone in its domain. To pay taxes, to own property, to carry citizenship, to use money, to be educated, all implicate us in a political system. We are being political when we are in positions of power, when we are making demands of those in power, when we are submitting to those in power, or when we are rejecting those in power. I would suggest that trying to be a good citizen is just as political as engaging in illegal protest. They may not be the same thing, but they're both political. So the only real question, I think, and which is why I hoped we could gather here in this way, is to think about and discuss how we could bring together our theological call to address poverty within this current political and economic structure. Here, unfortunately, the Bible is less clear. The Bible, after all, contains stories of civil disobedience and mass protest, as well as calls to honor, obey, and even submit to unjust rulers. Most of our denominational histories, I suspect, are a mixed bag. As a Mennonite, my history is diverse. We have led violent and nonviolent protest, and we have allowed ourselves to be quietly used as pawns for colonization, not to mention all the expressions in between. So given all this diversity, it might be fair to take up the Apostle Paul's repeated refrain when he says in various situations, judge for yourselves. And so let's use this time tonight to judge for ourselves. Isaiah says to the people of God that they are to loose the chains of injustice, to undo heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Isaiah is clear that these chains and burdens are poverty, hunger, homelessness, and abusive treatment. Isaiah does not consider these realities moral failings, but forms of abuse. Poverty is punishing. Isaiah, though, goes on to say that poverty and injustice is an illness that affects everyone. We might say that there is only true wealth when it is shared, and only true healing when it is shared or a social reality. To those with the means and power to break the yoke of poverty, Isaiah says that your healing will spring up quickly. For the issue of poverty and injustice is chronic and debilitating, causing unnecessary suffering for some while ultimately hurting us all. So to break every yoke means not only to address poverty, but break everything that keeps us from the investment and intimacies of mutual well-being. So as we listen to our guests share opportunities and strategies for breaking the yoke of unnecessary struggle and suffering, may we also loosen our own obsession with personal gain and private security and begin to extend our intimacies and investments in ways that open up new ways of sharing what is good for all. So with that little meditation, we will open up our time to our guests, who will share for about 15 minutes each, after which we want to have a good chance for conversation. Leah Gazan will speak to motion 46 and a guaranteed livable income, which she has presented as a private member's motion in the House of Commons. And as she articulated before, there are differences among models of personal income support. Details are important, including her call for increased social supports. And so while Ms. Gazan advocates for the continuation and expansion of social supports, there is another conversation to be had around what is possible in our current economic structure, and how her motion or ones like it may inevitably play into continued privatization of public goods and services, leading to even more burdens on individuals. And so John Clark will be speaking to some of those concerns as well as alternatives. So we look forward to the insight gained in this time in the work for justice ahead. So at this time, I am going to invite Steve Heinrichs. I assume he is logged in, Director of Indigenous Settler Relations for Mennonite Church Canada, who will welcome our first guest.
Good evening, friends. And thank you, Dave, so much for the words that you offered up, that theological and political framing. Really helpful, so thank you. As mentioned, my name's Steve Heinrichs. I work with the Mennonite Church here in Winnipeg Center, this amazing community which is blessed to have Leah Gazan as our representative in Ottawa, fighting the good fight. Leah is a member of Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, which is located in Saskatchewan, Treaty 4. A longtime educator and community activist, Leah has spent her life fearlessly working for human rights on the local, national, and international stage, helping support so many in the struggle for justice and dignity. Leah serves as the New Democratic Party's critic for children, families, and social development. And last year, back on August 10th, 2020, she submitted motion 46 before the House of Commons, a motion to convert the Canada Emergency Response Benefit into a permanent, guaranteed, livable basic income. Leah, thank you so much for your work. We are so glad that you're here with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Steve. Always a pleasure to see my brother, and really appreciated your words, David, very powerful. We cannot understand poverty that we are experiencing today outside of race, gender, ableism, colonization, and the violent dispossession of land. Stories that usually begin at the time of invasion, stories void of people, void of ways of life, the great colonial lie that has set up a narrative that continues to dispossess even today. An erasure of Indigenous people and an erasure of people around the world who have and continue to be disrupted by violent colonialism. The kind of violent colonialism that has left Indigenous people poor and unsheltered on their own lands and susceptible to violence, where Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirits go missing with little or no action, as noted by former Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights, James Anaya, and where men and boys are murdered without justice, as discovered on Monday, this past Monday, in the case of Colton Boushie. We did not begin as a feudal system where the telling of colonial histories usually begin. In fact, Canada was built on the violent dispossession of lands of Indigenous peoples. What I argue is the foundation of capitalism today. In fact, Prior to these violent invasions, Indigenous peoples lived a sophisticated way of life with well-established educational practices, spiritual practices, governance systems, legal traditions, and economies that included gift giving. And benefits were not for a privileged few, but for all members of the nation. It was a way of life based on interdependence, reciprocity, and interconnectedness. Everyone had a place in that circle with a clear understanding that whenever you take something, you must always give something back. A way of life grounded in equity and equality, what I would actually deem the model for socialism, where nobody was left behind. Now, bring us to the 9th and 15th centuries with colonizers entering our territories during the feudal period. They assumed ownership over our lands, justified by doctrines of superiority. Indigenous people were seen as less than human, a justification for the violent dispossession of land. And feudal lords began structuring our society around relationships that were derived from being owners of the land in contrast to caretakers. And the only way one could benefit was through service and labor. And I would argue that we seem to be in the same paradigm today, but now the feudal lords have been replaced by corporations supported by the government who tribute the value of a human being to work and participation in the market economy that exploits workers, leaving behind individuals who do not fit within these structures, including many seniors, disabled persons, peoples experiencing severe mental health and trauma issues, and the heightened levels of discrimination and racism that makes it difficult for members of BIPOC communities to gain employment that pays a living wage and upholds the rights of workers. And the crown, a crown who continues to claim it owns all the power over lands and resources on Turtle Island and continues to perpetuate colonial violence even today. Wet'suwet'en Territory, Site C Dam, Muskrat Falls, TMX, and the fact that across Canada, polluting projects, risky pipelines, and tainted drinking water disproportionately impact Indigenous, Black, and people of color. This is called environmental racism and is the root of capitalism, which started with the invaders of lands that continue to wreak havoc against Indigenous nations today. You cannot talk about poverty outside of the politics of race, gender, racism, ableism, colonization, and land dispossession. To do otherwise is a futile exercise of washing over ongoing white supremacy and racism that supports inequalities and inequities, even today. Nearly 15% of older single individuals live in poverty. 80% of Indigenous women who are incarcerated for reasons of poverty. 34% of First Nations women and girls live in poverty. Nearly 15% of elderly single individuals live in poverty. 30% of Canadians with disabilities live in poverty and make up 41% of low-income population. 45% of the overall homeless populations lives with a disability or mental illness. 1.3 million children in Canada live in poverty. That is 1 in 5 children. And 40% of Indigenous children in Canada live in poverty, and 60% of Indigenous children live in poverty on reserves. And 1 in 5 racialized families live in poverty in Canada, as opposed to 1 in 20 for non-racialized families. And it is abhorrent that Canada continues to break the rule of law by failing in its obligations to address poverty, something we are obliged to do. In fact, the federal government has a legal obligation to uphold domestic and international human rights conventions. We even continue to break the rule of law by failing to uphold our very own Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, Article 7, in particular. And in midst of all of this, dangerous discussions continue to be had about which minimum human rights we should tackle first, which never happens. And once again, usually by individuals in power whose rights are currently respected, picking and choosing what they wish to support: clean water, universal childcare, affordable housing. Because their lives or loss of lives do not depend on policy agendas being the flavor of the day, making decisions from a distance without being in the trenches of poverty, conveniently choosing to invoke the rule of law when it suits the economic narrative, and then pushing other rights aside when it does not. A lack of political will from those in power to resolve the poverty crisis. For example, failing to go after offshore tax havens while having the political will to put in place laws to fine people living in poverty for loitering on the streets when their home is the streets, where the order of the day is to put bars on bus benches to make sure the unsheltered cannot use it as a place to rest. Certainly, if somebody can stay up all night figuring out how to make being unsheltered even more difficult, they could exercise the same intellectual imagination to figure out how to go after offshore tax havens and to ensure affordable, accessible social housing and a guaranteed livable income for all. Poverty is a very violent human rights violation. And intellectual discussions about revolutions to overthrow systems of oppression by perpetuating piecemeal approaches in addressing poverty, once again, born on the backs of BIPOC who continue to risk our bodies fighting the front lines, on the front lines for minimum human rights. Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, 1492 Land Back. A righteous discussion also rooted in privilege and an attempt to control the narrative of the oppressed, the poor, the neglected, the forgotten, the invisible. Even the discussion around neoliberalism is born on the backs of the poor. My good friend, John, who I'm looking forward to hearing tonight, in referring to the neoliberal trap of basic income, stated that, in quotes, ongoing project to create an ever more elastic and precarious workforce underway, basic income leads to a situation where a portion of the wage bill is now covered by general tax revenues. When in fact, ample research has demonstrated the long-term cost benefits of ensuring people have what they need to thrive, not to survive. Looking after people is never a burden. The burden is the gross amount of waste that is had by not taxing the ultra rich, not going after offshore tax havens, fossil fuel subsidies, and corporate bailouts. Tax revenues wasted on the $50 million that was given to MasterCard, $12 million to Loblaws to buy fridges, banks, billions of dollars to bail out big oil, and never mind buying a $4.5 billion leaky pipeline in the midst of a climate crisis. Like, why is that not being the problem being identified? Instead of protecting the status quo, it is time they pay their fair share and support greater equity and equality in this country, especially when the wealth was born out of the willful and ongoing oppression and dispossession of BIPOC communities. And if the main argument is about responsible spending, let's talk about the high costs of poverty, because poverty is one of the largest financial burdens on the economy, healthcare, and criminal justice systems in Canada. When you don't look after people, it costs a lot of money. For example, with all elements considered, it costs $147,000 to incarcerate a person in a federal prison for 1 year. Poverty is the largest social determinant of health. And even with conservative estimates, the cost of poverty on the Canadian healthcare system is $7.6 billion a year. Canadians' high school dropout rate is around between 4 and 14%, something that increases to 50% in low-income communities because you cannot learn when you are hungry. And this neoliberal argument falls even shorter when looking at First Nations communities where unemployment can be anywhere as high as between 85 and 95% as a result of being cut off the Canadian economy through the Indian Act, where single individuals live off $120 biweekly on EIA. Can you imagine being that poor while you watch others getting rich off your own lands and resources? Manitoba Hydro. It is time to heed the call for justice of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, Call to Justice 4.5, which calls for the establishment of a guaranteed annual livable income for all Canadians, including Indigenous peoples. This call for justice comes directly from families of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirits, because we know there is a direct correlation between poverty and violence that has resulted in the murder and disappearance of almost 5,000 Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit in Canada. When you leave people without choices, you place people at risk. Poverty costs lives. Poverty kills. So I share my frustrations with these theoretical analyses about poverty while people continue to die on the streets of Winnipeg. All privilege in this country that was born out of the dispossession of land of Indigenous peoples and on the backs of BIPOC communities and disabled seniors, students, women who continue to be the poorest of the poor in this country. And the analysis and conclusion often reach in the absence of our voices. Systems doing exactly what they were designed to do, keeping people down. It is targeted and intentional. Poor voices in this country are silenced voices. And I want to be clear, I am in full support of a living wage. I am in the full support of continuing to fight for the rights of workers, but it does not have to be one thing or the other. However, finally, we could support systems where nobody would be desperate to take any job offered at any wage because they would not be required to work in order to receive a basic income, like was witnessed with migrant workers in a factory during COVID pandemic in Ontario, being provided food rations by their employer in overcrowded sleeping quarters, a breeding ground for COVID-19. Not having to put up with work that was degrading or wage insufficient because they could refuse a job offer. This puts the power in the hands of the worker, and potential employee has the power finally to walk away. And the artists would finally have what they need to thrive and not just survive. Because really, can you imagine the pandemic without music, poetry, art, paintings? I can't. That's what's kept my spirit alive. And other work not valued in capital systems, including care works, such as taking care of your parent. And for the diverse reasons, the many people that are not able to work. Motion 46 was not introduced, in fact, to gut the social safety net. The motion is very specific and does not replace our existing social safety net. Rather, it is in addition to our current and future government public services and income supports that are meant to meet special, exceptional, and other distinct needs and goals rather than basic needs. It is designed to build on our current guaranteed income programs that are no longer livable, OAS, child tax benefit, EIA, and make them livable and expand them out. A permanent guaranteed livable income available to Canadians over the age of 18, single persons, students, families, persons with disabilities, temporary foreign workers, permanent residents, and refugee claimants. The motion specifically calls for the expansion of accessible, affordable social housing and expanded health services. Now, I'm not arguing that guaranteed income is a silver bullet. A basic income alongside the strengthening of our social safety net will provide a concerted effort to eradicate poverty and ensure the respect, dignity, security, and human rights of all persons living in Canada. It is time to stop making excuses about why we can't tackle ending poverty head on, because we can do it. Like, let's start by using the approximately $750 billion of liquidity support given during the pandemic that socialized the risk while privatizing the profits to banks and investing in people so they can thrive and not just survive and realize their right to joy. It's about choices. And I choose human rights, not big corporations, not banks, and not perpetuating systems that maintain the status quo. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and inspiring to hear, and look forward to digging into some questions in a bit. So yeah, thank you very much. At this time, I'm going to invite James Wilt. He is a Winnipeg author and organizer to introduce our second speaker. I'll let you unmute yourself, James.
Great. Thanks so much, David. Hi there. My name's James Wilt. I use he, him pronouns. As David mentioned, I'm a local writer and student at the University of Manitoba. It's a huge privilege for me to be able to introduce John at this event tonight. We've never met, but John's work is a huge personal inspiration. So just a very quick bio about John, although I'm sure much more could be said. John Clark came to Canada from the UK, where he has been active in trade union struggle since. He then got involved with the anti-poverty movement, and for 28 years was an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, also known as OCAP. And he's now Packer Visitor in Social Justice at York University in Toronto. John's also a prolific writer. He's written extensively on the specific question of basic income, which is being discussed tonight, including for Canadian Dimension, Spring Magazine, Counterfire, and the Canada Files. I personally find his perspective on the subject to be incredibly thoughtful and important for everyone to consider, regardless of one's own personal opinion about the policy. I'm really, really pleased that this discussion is happening tonight between Leah and John. So without taking up any more time, I'm really pleased to introduce John tonight. Thanks to everyone who has worked to put this event together and participated in it, especially Leah and David. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of this discussion. Thanks so much.
Sorry. So thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for the kind invitation, and thanks to Leah for the very powerful and important presentation that she made. I'd like to perhaps begin by saying that we're going to have a discussion about a particular social policy initiative of basic income. And there's going to be some differences around it, and I'm going to respectfully put forward a different point of view on that particular policy than Leah has. But I also want to make clear that I'm very far from saying that that is the dividing line, this social policy disagreement. I was in full agreement, more than full agreement, with everything that was said about the need to challenge capitalism and how a challenge to capitalism in the context of Canada must be also an anti-colonial struggle, and how we must fight the racism that's so fundamental to this society and so fundamental to poverty that that is faced by so many people. And so we've got to build a movement in which that is the driving force. And the question of basic income is a secondary consideration, but an important one. So I'm going to deal with to try to set out in brief my take on why I think it's not the approach that we need to take. I recognize fully that we are living in hard times for many people, and we're living in enormously uncertain times. And in raising the point that I do, I don't expect by any means to have everyone agree with me. What I hope to do is to put forward some basic propositions that I hope people will take with them, that they'll think about and they'll consider. And I ask no more than that. This is not a debate; it's a discussion, and I hope a constructive and a respectful one. If I'm going to try to say why I've come to the conclusion, and I'm not alone in anti-poverty circles by any manner of means in reaching this conclusion, that basic income is not the way forward, before we can consider basic income, we have to talk about precisely what an income support system in general is in this capitalist system. How it arises, how income support arises, and what function it serves. And basically, capitalist society and capitalist economy, more than anything, rest on job markets. And job markets are shaped by economic coercion. People go to work and work for employers, not because they love their employers, but because they need to survive. And so historically, income support systems have emerged in situations where the various states, deemed it necessary to establish some level of social provision because of unemployment, sometimes mass unemployment, and because of other people who were outside of the job market. And to provide nothing was impossible because of the level of social dislocation and even social unrest that would accrue. And so income support has been provided as that basic minimum, that reluctant concession. But they have always been enormously concerned that the level that is provided is not going to be enough to interfere with the economic coercion that the job market rests on. So if you go back to the roots of the thing and you look at the English Poor Law Commission of 1834, they develop a principle of less eligibility that says exactly that income must be low as possible, and it must be provided under conditions that are calculated as unpleasant as they possibly can be. And so that basic function of income support system has always been one that the system has rested on. Even governments that have been the most reform-minded have generally moved the least on questions of income support. Now, the years of neoliberal austerity have been years in which that has been intensified. There were two economists working with Milton Friedman out of the Chicago School of Economics in 1974 who wrote a paper in which they said, unemployment is at very high levels at this particular point, but wages are not coming down. Why is that? And the answer they come up with was that unemployment insurance and welfare programs have made unemployment insufficiently terrifying. The 40 or so years of the neoliberal agenda that we've lived through has been the application of that very principle coming out of the Chicago School of Economics. Income support systems have been degraded calculatedly, so as to increase the rate of exploitation and so as to create a mushrooming, low-wage, precarious workforce. And that has led to a huge intensification of poverty, racialized poverty, a huge intensification of homelessness, and that's all true. And I'm not suggesting that is something we be reconciled to. Quite the contrary. But I will say this: that the extent to which we can push back on that is the extent to which we build movements that are strong enough to push back on that. And I have to say, with all due respects to all the good intentions of people who say they want a form of basic income that's adequate and doesn't erode other programs and such like, the question of what is possible will be decided by the actual balance of forces that exist in society, by how strong we are to push back against precisely the forces of capitalism that's been referred to. And so I would argue that there isn't, in fact, some inherent quality in a basic income that gets around the problem. If we introduced a system of basic income today, it would be subject to exactly the same pressures of austerity and cutback, exactly the same liberal conservative parties that want to implement austerity, precisely the same corporate boardrooms that are pushing for them to do it would be attacking a system of basic income in exactly the same fashion. And there are two particular problems I see with basic income, and I've suggested this in the past, that actually are extremely unhelpful in terms of challenging the neoliberal agenda that we're talking about. And the first is just that it creates a de facto subsidy to low-wage employers. You extend the system of cash benefits out, so for the most part, it's covering low-wage workers. And I would suggest that with that system, with that payment kept low, you would have a situation where it took the pressure off of employers and it took the pressure off of governments to increase minimum wages. It would have a depressing effect on wages. The second thing is, and this is articulated by Charles Murray, right-wing political scientist who advocates strongly for basic income. The important thing for basic income, as far as he's concerned, it was the same with Milton Friedman. The important thing is that you don't use it to augment and improve the social infrastructure. You use it to replace it. And again, it's quite possible to design on a drawing board a system of basic income that doesn't do that. But I'm saying that the prevailing agenda of privatization and austerity makes it inevitable that is exactly how the thing would be used, how basic income would be used. That would be my submission, and that's why I think it's a mistake for us to go in that direction. I do believe that instead, because I'm far from suggesting that the status quo is acceptable. The ECOS poll people recently found that 70% of people in this country were saying that there needed to be fundamental changes to Canadian society, and I think we should go with that, absolutely. But I do believe it better to focus on, rather than a top-up system, actually focus on making the employers pay, challenging low-wage precarious work, challenging the abandonment and poverty that has been built into the system. Rather than spend billions on extending the cash payment and commodifying social provision, I would say that we would be far better to focus our efforts on social housing so that the money doesn't go to private landlords, strengthening healthcare systems with pharmacare and denticare, free and accessible public transit. And of course, a universal childcare program that actually exists rather than being a perennial liberal promise over an intergenerational span. So those are the directions that I believe we should go in. And as part of that, absolutely, we need income support systems in place that are strong and are accessible. We need a system of unemployment insurance that meets people's needs. We need the provincial social assistance system and disability benefits to be massively increased to living levels, made available to people, and to be purged of all the bureaucratic intrusion and moral policing that is built into them at the moment. But I don't believe that the best way forward for our movement is to extend the commodification of social provision. I think we should put our efforts into those fights in the other areas that I've outlined. The post-pandemic period is not going to be an easy time. It's going to be a very, very harsh time. I believe we should convene a pan-Canadian assembly. I believe we should have a commitment to build movements of struggle and social resistance. We should challenge all of the things that are wrong in this society, and we should agree on that, even if we disagree on basic income. But I do believe that as a priority, basic income is very sincerely put forward with very real hopes by progressive people. But as a commodification of social provision, it is in the end a retreat before the capitalist marketplace and the neoliberal agenda. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both. That was wonderful and a lot to to process in a short amount of time. Certainly, as if you are like myself out there that you have been listening, we do have a good chunk of time now for follow-up questions. I would encourage you to post something specific in the chat there, and if it's directed to either Mr. Clark or Ms. Gazan specifically, please please indicate so. I appreciated, I think, a deep that kind of underlying sense of acknowledging the structures that have kept certain forms of struggle and unnecessary suffering alive and well that I heard in both presentations, and really appreciate that. I wonder, I'll start perhaps with a question, and I'll bring it back to Ms. Gazan, and just if you could speak to, I can only imagine, I work in church politics. I don't know what national politics are like, so I can literally only imagine. When you hear, when we see sort of the reality of promises made and then compromises kind of in the follow through in a lot of political action, just if you could speak a little bit to this question of what it might take to get traction, given all the other stakeholders that have other agendas for personal income in relation to what your agenda, and maybe also even to I haven't read, so there's what's the number? Bill C-273, is that there's a recent bill around studying personal income. So if you want to speak to around this broader commitment, but then what does this mean around gaining traction within the current political and economic structure?
Well, I think it already has traction. In fact, if you look at polls across provinces, the majority, like for example, 60% of Manitobans support a guaranteed livable basic income. We're coming out of a pandemic. Families are rolling out on the streets at this point. And there is lots of support. In fact, my motion 46 garnered over 50,000 signatures. The petition that I posted online. And I think it's really important we have this discussion. I mean, even when you look at the EI system was designed for white working males during the Depression. We now know that everybody's not a male, and we also know that we have great diversity. And we also acknowledge things like diversity of people. And, I think I pointed out many people who are left outside of this discussion, and the whole notion around only providing support to those who work is actually a very neoliberal construct that was developed in the feudal times, I would argue. What I'm saying is that wherever you find yourself in life, that everybody has a right to live in dignity. The other point, and that I certainly made in my presentation, is this shouldn't be an option. We have domestic and international obligations, human rights obligations, to ensure that everybody can live with dignity and security of the person. All I'm doing merely is heeding my role, my responsibility as a member of Parliament, to uphold our Canadian Charter and fight to ensure that everybody can live with dignity and human rights. And there's nobody who would know in terms of pushing back. Certainly as an Indigenous person in this country, as an Indigenous woman, I don't, even under the Indian Act today, have the same rights as other women, never mind men. So I understand very well legislative oppression, even as a sitting member in the House of Commons. But this piecemeal approach to justice, whether it be, we'll focus on clean drinking water and reserves, and we'll hit housing later. And this is, from my perspective, we need to change that culture, and we need to push back against choices that are being made. One of the choices happened during the pandemic that I pointed out was the $750 billion of liquidity that was given to banks during the pandemic. We have the resources. It's up to us to push for change. And I would say that's in the ballot box. I'm hoping that this is a main ballot box issue, that either you support ensuring that every person residing in Canada is afforded the right to live in dignity, or you're not going to get my vote. I think there's a lot of power in that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I want to acknowledge a lot of us are lay people. There's a lot of terms being thrown around that some of us are not familiar with. So there was one question here for Mr. Clark. Could you perhaps for us lay people just say a little bit about what the meaning of commodification of social provision?
Yes. And I apologize for using the term. I actually used it next to, I think, extending the cash payment system, which is sort of what I was trying to get across. Yeah, I mean, what I was suggesting was that if you, while there is an enormous need to strengthen income support systems, if you put your focus in terms of the list of comprehensive demands that you're fighting for, if you put your focus on trying to extend the cash benefit system, then you are precisely increasing the degree to which social provision provides cash that is then that it then enters the capitalist marketplace. I mean, the obvious example, perhaps one of the most important ones of what I'm trying to put across, is the question of housing. The payments that went to people, even in this exceptional period of providing initially CERB, there was a huge amount of that went to private landlords. Not that I'm for a moment suggesting it was that CERB was not needed and should have been stronger in the health crisis, but so much of it went to private landlords. As was mentioned at the beginning, I'm from the UK originally, and I'm also old enough to have grown up there in a time when council housing, a great gain of struggle and of the Labour government that followed the Second World War, council housing was extended to the point where it wasn't a provision to just the poorest people. It was part of mainstream working class life. Social housing was extended massively, and it made a huge difference in terms of people's living standards, in terms of people's health. So I'm far from suggesting that what's needed at this period is to just pick out a couple of things and say, make it this, make it that. We need a broad package of demands. We need to strengthen the social infrastructure. We need to have a commitment that we're not going back, never mind accepting what has happened since the pandemic. We're not going back to the way it was before. We need to really commit to those things. But I am suggesting that the basic income, though it is taken forward with the best of intentions, given the prevailing agenda that we're up against, this commodification of social provision will actually work against us, in my view.
Thank you. A couple of questions here for Ms. Gazan. Some questions about how other models of basic income in other, if there's other countries that we can look to, how has impacted their society. And then perhaps a follow-up would be if you could speak to the difference between your motion and the bill that is introduced by Liberal MP Julie D. I think that's that Bill C-273. So if you want to speak to those.
Sure. What was the first part of the question? Sorry.
Just if there's a practical example in other country and how what we can learn from.
It's been a long day of multitasking. I'm so sorry. We actually have had studies in Manitoba done by brilliant folks like Evelyn Forget in the Dauphin study, in fact, where they actually found by putting in place a guaranteed livable, like an income, that they immediately saw, for example, cost savings in healthcare. Mental health improved. And in fact, although there's a lot of stereotypes that it de-incentivizes work, that actually didn't happen. People continued to work, graduation rates went up. We know when you look after people, and as a longtime academic and educator at university, looking at families and children in the Faculty of Education, we know that when you look after people, it immediately saves money. So we actually have Manitoba-born studies of the benefits of a guaranteed income. And again, I think it's important to note that we actually already have guaranteed incomes in this country. OAS is an example, something that was born in Winnipeg Centre under the leadership of the sky didn't fall. The whole order of capitalism didn't blow up, because we know whatever we do, we are always fighting against what I've been calling a growing corporate dictatorship. The problem is they're no longer livable. Disability payments, why I've had pretty much support from disability organizations across the country for my motion, are not livable. So what my motion actually called upon was very similar, that was found in the Mincome study, was that the guaranteed livable income must be in addition to current and future government programs, services, and support, including affordable, accessible social housing. And that's one of the areas that really differs what I'm proposing to what my Liberal colleague is proposing. Particularly 3D1, which is concerning, where she talks about a replacement of. That's not what guaranteed livable income experts, certainly Guaranteed Income Canada and Guaranteed Income Manitoba are calling for. It's very specific. It's making our current income guarantees livable and expanding them out for those who are left behind. Because I can tell you, even on the CERB, when they transfer the CERB back to EI, only 40% qualified. And so we can talk about landlords benefiting, we can talk about that, but you can also put in other regulations to ensure that landlords don't start exploiting people with guaranteed incomes. And in fact, with the rent assist in Manitoba, that actually never occurred. So when in Manitoba, a couple of years back, they provided the rent assist, we didn't all of a sudden see an explosion in rent, because people who were given rent assist were also given the autonomy to choose how they wanted to spend their rent assist, whether it was on rent or other things that we need to survive, food, hydro, So maybe I'll leave it there, because I know there's lots of questions and I want to hog all the time.
Yeah, for sure. I see 30 new ones at the bottom of the chat, so we'll see where we can get. Maybe I'll just a quick technical. If you could have a quick response, a comment around. For a lot of years, we just heard about UBI in terms of flat rate, everybody, and then we'll tax at the upper limits later. So why your approach as opposed to sort of that model of UBI for everyone?
Oh, well, I'm totally not proposing that. Like, if you look at Andrew Yang's model, for example, in the States, he's looking at giving everybody just a cash payment, right? In replacement of the social safety net. I am not proposing that at all. In fact, a guaranteed livable basic income would be provided to those who don't have it. It's very different. And we have income guarantees, as I've indicated, in the country already. OAS, disability payments, the child tax benefit, EI is also an income guarantee. All, I would argue, that are not livable. And I'm telling you, you say, okay, is it possible? Is it plausible? You know what? Fighting for social justice in this country by putting limitations, by allowing your imagination to stay within the confines of a capitalist system in terms of dictating what we should be asking for, I can tell you that is the pedagogy of the oppressed, and I will not stop until people are provided with what they need to live with dignity and human rights in this country. And I will not be limited by capitalist dogma of piecemeal approaches that are resulting in people dying in the streets.
Okay, I'm just scrolling a little bit here. So, I mean, a lot of the conversation, a lot of what I'm reading is sort of this, we're really working at in terms of people that are invested in the kind of vision and approach that I hear from both Mr. Clark and Ms. Gazan. There's the immediate implication of what we can do right now, given the system, and there's the working at addressing the system itself. And I think that's a perennial tension or reality. Just trying to think. Well, that was more of a comment. So they were kind of commenting that didn't really end in a question. I thought I could end on a good question there. Just an observation, more of a comment, not a question, as they say in these things. Okay. So I hear people, and this is something I maybe kind of wanted to save a little bit at the end, but I hear a lot of it as a subtext in a lot of the comments here. Oh, my video got shut off here, sorry. So for the average person, I wonder if both of you perhaps could comment. What I hear from both of you is building capacity and strength, and I appreciated Mr. Clark's comments that in the end, when we put these things forward, we confront sort of a balance of forces. I wonder, certainly as Ms. Gazan said, we have the ballot box, but beyond that, in terms of the average person in their daily life, what sort of encouragements or advice would you give people that would help to become increasingly aware of and respond to the structures that are perhaps not affecting themselves as immediately, but are so pervasive for other people's lives? Is that you understand what I'm asking there? If perhaps both of you could share for a minute.
Yes, I glad to respond at least a little bit. I mean, I think this debate or this discussion is now taking place in a context that I don't think any of us have quite appreciated how dramatically things have changed. There was already, I mean, we talk about the poverty that has grown up during, especially in recent decades. We talk about the inequality that has emerged in society, but that's only, I mean, before the pandemic struck, there was already developing an enormous global economic crisis. Hanging over it all is an increasingly, and we haven't mentioned it yet, but it's the biggest question of all, is this huge ecological crisis that's manifesting itself more and more in people's lives. It's causing people hardship, it's putting people in danger, and is having economically devastating effects. So we are in a period where we are going to have to think about what demands we put on the table, and we are going to have to think about how we fight back, and we are going to have to think in terms of how that fight back contributes to a very different kind of society. And I do think that's something that's very much occurring to people. I think there is a pervasive sense that things are very bad, that things threaten to get worse, and we have to find ways to move forward. And I think that I certainly believe that involves the ballot box, but I also believe it means building mass mobilizations of people that are affected by these issues. I think it means challenging this society in really very, very fundamental ways. The basic income disagreement is very significant and very important, but in the end, the bigger question is how we're going to fight in this period ahead. There is a crisis, and who's going to pay for it? And it can't be the people in the corporate boardrooms that get away with fostering that on people and on people's lives. And so I think it starts at the level of workplaces, and it starts at the level of communities, and it starts with people defending themselves. But I think we're seeing we're in a period where people are ready to fight for things. During this pandemic, we've seen globally, first of all, we saw George Floyd killed by the police in Minneapolis, and this huge mobilization take place around racial justice in the United States that spread internationally. Now we see Indian farmers mobilizing in incredible numbers. I think it's the kind of period we're living in. I think we can think in very, very bold terms about the demands we put on the table, and think very clearly about the kind of society we want to live in. It has to be very different to this capitalist and this colonial society that we live in at the moment.
Yes, thanks very much. And I would put on the table that I don't think this is new times. I think inequality started in this country at the time of invasion, that threw people off their traditional land, something that is actually occurring in real time. Imposed by corporations, big oil, big companies that continue on with the same behavior. I think nothing changes if nothing changes. And I think there's many examples, and certainly current examples and ongoing examples, like the fact that when you look at the fact that the roots of inequality started at the time of invasion, that left Indigenous peoples, many Indigenous peoples, poor and unsheltered, even on our own lands. In fact, 70% of the unsheltered community in the city of Winnipeg are Indigenous. And the fact that we are here, the fact that we are still here, is an act of resistance. And so I think that's really important to note, and not just Indigenous folks. Black Lives Matter, I said, 1492 land back, and the so many allies that have joined as allies in the struggle for social justice. And I agree with my friend John here. I think now is the time, if ever, that we are at a moment where we can ask for both things. And I think a guaranteed livable basic income, in addition to current and future supports, is a very, very bold way to eradicate poverty. Because I have to say, I tire of piecemeal approaches, of picking and choosing which human right to honor and which one not to. It's costing lives. Poverty is violent. Poverty is the most violent human rights violation. And it's time that we put things on the table. Clean drinking water for First Nations is one thing, but then are you going to deal with the 20 people in some communities that live in one house? It's time that we put human rights on the table and go for bust. And we have the resources. I gave many examples in my presentation about how it's about making choices to instead of investing in big corporations and corporate buddies and economies that are no longer viable, it's time to invest in bold action. And I would say a guaranteed livable basic income is one of them. The other thing I want to comment about is this whole notion about revolution, because I want to tell you, when you talk about revolution and being on the front line, it's time we really dissect that whole notion, because it is born on the backs, as I said, of BIPOC peoples. We should just have the same human rights as other folks. If you look at the demographics of people living in poverty, we're not here to entertain people with revolution. And I think allies, to be an ally, it's standing up and saying, we want everybody that lives in this place that's now called Canada to be afforded the minimum human rights, at least at the very bare minimum, the minimum human rights that they require to live in dignity and to have security of the person, something that's part of our charter. I don't think we should negotiate on the charter, the Canadian charter. I don't think human rights should be up for debate. I don't think they're partisan. Human rights are human rights.
Thank you. So here's a question. I haven't heard this, and this, so maybe perhaps both of you could speak for a minute on a couple of things. So there's a question here. Women in the union movement have told me that a GLI will further reinforce women to be the primary caregivers of children instead of men, perpetuating gender inequality in the home and reducing women's status in the labor market. If you would, either of you would, well, Ms. Gazan, I'd ask you to speak to that in terms of your motion. And perhaps, well, why don't you speak to that, and then I have a follow-up after, perhaps for both of you.
Sure. Well, there's actually no research to affirm that assumption. And what I would argue is that when you look at women, it's absolutely true. They're the prime caregivers often in the household for aging parents. All of this is true. Often working and being the head of a household and having like a superhero cape and doing all these things. I mean, like, this is the reality of life. So I certainly don't take away from that. But what research does show is that when you provide people with a guaranteed, a livable basic income, then they can start pursuing what they want to pursue. I know a good friend of mine has been working for a long time. During the pandemic, she received CERB. She was finally able to spend the time she wanted to open up her own business. What it does is it gives people choices, whether they want to stay at home, if they choose to stay at home, to not have to stay at home and in poverty, or if they want to work. And as I said in the Dauphin study, in fact, what they found was, in fact, it doesn't de-incentivize work. People continued to work. So I know that could be a concern, but I want to let you know that it hasn't been proven in research.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that responds a bit to what a follow-up question. Something I hear a lot about when we hear about this, or when we talk about increasing kind of universal support regardless of participation in the job market, is precisely that disconnect around us being so informed by that need to be employed at whatever cost in the existing economic framework. So I would be curious, and again, bear in mind, a lot of us here don't have a strong economics background. Speak to some of those, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of it, that relationship between, well, this takes away what we would call incentive. How does that relate to what some would call currently a type of coercion that we're actually trying to make? And I think as a culture, we often bought in, we actually want to make not working unpleasant. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to help us begin to think beyond some of those kind of categories. Mr. Clark, why don't you have a few words on that? Oh, just a second, you're muted still.
I vowed I would make this the first time I didn't do that. The notion of disincentive, that's very much the focus of right-wing opposition to basic income. because in truth, the right is as divided as the left on the question of basic income. But that's very much the focus of the objection, is you're going to give people this unconditional money and universal sloth is going to set in, and society is going to fall apart. I don't actually think that's particularly true. The truth is that that people, if they have additional income, are probably still going to be going into the job market in very, very, very large numbers. And the concern of trying to ensure that coercive element there, that's not what I'm focused on trying to do. I'm certainly trying to challenge it to the best of my ability. But there is, on the left, I think, the sort of notion that basic income can be something, it can be something that will enable people to enter the job market or not enter the job market as they see fit. That's certainly some of the more radical advocates of a universal basic income have put forward that idea. The Belgian advocate of basic income, Philippe Van Parijs, actually has described basic income as the capitalist road to communism. So the notion is that you're going to provide people with a totally adequate income, and then if they decide to go into the job market, they will. If they decide to do something else, that's also fine. I think you need to understand that to achieve anything like that, you would have to, you mentioned, David, the question of the balance of forces. You'd have to change the balance of forces massively to create a situation where you force the state to provide the whole working class population with what would essentially be an unlimited strike fund. They are not going to move in the direction of an income support system that gives people that level of choice. That removes 40 years of neoliberal agenda. In fact, it removes the basis for the capitalist job market itself. We need to fight for the things we can win. But the notion that there is, without some incredible change in the balance of forces, the capacity to put something like that in place, I think is not realistic or possible.
Ms. Gazan, did you want to speak to that?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. I mean, really, it comes down to, like, in my mind, there's a certain, for my, like, again, so this is very European, the Protestant work ethic or whatever, that this is fundamental to being human, is to go out and to work and to earn, and anything that would take away any of that incentive is bad. And so I hear those sorts of comments. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to the question of giving people actual choice around work, and how we can think beyond the categories we've been formed in. Sorry, I know it's a very general question. But
I think it's a great question, and I think research actually proves out otherwise. We have to go back to just being a human being. Human beings need a sense of purpose. I can't imagine, even if I won a lottery, just to end my life sitting on a couch watching movies all day. Everybody needs a sense of purpose. And I think that's why in guaranteed income studies, what they've actually found was it doesn't de-incentivize work. People actually still work, but it does give people more choice in work. And it does give them options. Let's say if they're being exploited by an employer, as we saw in Ontario with migrant workers who were being fed food rations, living in a high school locker, a breeding ground for COVID-19, that they are not beholden to be abused by these big corporations, and they can actually walk away and find better work where they're not being exploited. And I think we also have to understand that not everybody can work. 70% of adults with severe intellectual disabilities or intellectual disabilities live in poverty. People with very severe mental health and trauma who require supports to thrive may be able to even work 2 days a week, 3 days a week, but may not be able to hold down a full-time job. The many seniors in our community literally choosing between medication and rent, food and medication. Are we going to say to seniors where OAS payments are not enough anymore, get back to work? Or students, many young people, why should students live in poverty in this country? Students work really hard. I taught in post-secondary for almost 20 years. There's nobody who works harder than students. Students work so hard, and artists. The kinds of works that has always been disrespected in capitalist systems could finally do their job of art and provide that level of joy that we've all probably indulged in, those of us who are privileged to have homes and TVs and books and places to listen to music. We could finally respect their contribution by ensuring they had a guaranteed livable income. So guaranteed livable income isn't about de-incentivizing work. In fact, research shows that it does the contrary. What it does is it ensures that whatever happens in your life, including during a pandemic, that you still are able to live with human rights and dignity. And I think nobody, however we differ on this topic, would disagree with me that they believe in human rights and that they believe that everybody in Canada should have human rights and that everybody in Canada should have what they need to live in dignity. I think we can all agree on that.
So we're getting pretty close to our 90 minutes here, and I want to respect folks' time and evenings here and energies. I'm going to read one comment that I actually quite appreciated here, and then after that I'll allow for just some closing remarks from both speakers. So someone wrote here, I've been able to do more for myself mentally and emotionally while I was on CERB than I've ever been able to do while having to work to survive. I wouldn't be where I am creatively if it weren't for the chance to go beyond basic survival. And I think that's quite a wonderful testimony to what, again, is a very shared vision by I think both folks here today. So I would like to before maybe I give you both of you the last word, I don't have a great the United Church, the Anglican Church. There's plenty of us from the Mennonite Church here. Here's stuff we can take back to our conversation. There's more stuff to read. This video will be posted and can be shared for conversation, and we can continue to organize beyond that. So again, I'll let you both perhaps have some concluding thoughts, and if again, a word of encouragement, knowing that many of us don't always feel like we have a lot of time and energy in our day, but are concerned about this and how you might encourage us going forward. So Mr. Clark, if you'd like to go first.
Yes, of course. I would just quickly like to say, with regards to CERB, that I do believe that income support should be at least at the level that CERB provided. But I don't think we can assume that that's what they intend. I think CERB was provided in a particular context of a public health crisis and a lockdown. And Trudeau himself appeared on a Financial Times online symposium in which he very emphatically said that the intention was not to make that the new level for income support. So we have an uphill fight in our hands to win that kind of level of adequacy for income support. I just say, by way of conclusion, though, that I think that there is no question that Leah is putting forward a concept of basic income that is passionately adhered to, strongly believed in. But the model that is actually adopted is going to reflect precisely the prevailing agenda and the dominant political agenda and social agenda that's being forced on us at the moment. The Yang model, unfortunately, is a lot more in line with that prevailing agenda. So if basic income is adopted, it faces, as I said at the outset, exactly the same pressures of austerity and containment that exist at the moment. Existing systems of of income support, social assistance, disability payments, etc., are indeed pitifully inadequate. But the assumption that there is some inherent quality in basic income as it would actually be implemented that would ensure that it reaches levels of adequacy, not without a huge fight. And that's true of all incomes, all systems of income support. So finally, I make this point, is that I don't think that what we want is precisely a piecemeal approach. I think we need to elaborate out of our communities, out of our workplaces, out of our community organizations, out of our unions. We need to collectively elaborate a comprehensive platform of demands and goals that would make a real difference in people's lives right now. I'm actually not opposed to revolution. I'm actually not opposed to trying to change society fundamentally, but we can't wait for that. I think we need to be struggling on those fronts now in very practical and strong ways. I disagree that something that extends the reach of the marketplace, something that commodifies social provision is the way to go. But regardless of that, we must fight to make a real difference in people's lives, and we must build movements that are capable of doing that. That's more important even than the basic income debate.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Ms. Gazan.
Thank you. And I just want to point out, I wasn't told you're on mute for the first time in existence during the panel. But I just want to start out by, first of all, thanking the Mennonite Church, the United Church and the Anglican Church for hosting this tonight. I've worked very closely with faith groups over the year around reconciliation efforts. And I've just learned so much, and I want to let you know that it's helped with my own reconciliation with the faith community. And so whenever I'm given a choice or an opportunity to share, I just want to thank you for that and for opening up these spaces to have difficult discussions. John, thank you for all your work as a poverty advocate in Ontario. I know that you've been working on these issues for many years, and I would like to honor your work. And although our views differ, I want to honor the fact that we're both working towards eradicating poverty. So, thank you, John, for being with all of us today. I just want to make clear, whether guaranteed livable basic income comes into effect, austerity will not start with it, will not end with it. I think that's the system that was created at the time of invasion, that literally was born out of an erasure of peoples. And I see that same behavior in my very own backyard, where people are so used to the violence of poverty that they don't even see it. The fact that, in the last couple of weeks, we've lost 3 people, a woman, another Indigenous woman that was found, perished on the streets, a man who froze to death in a bus shack. You have to be at least at minus 21.5 degrees Celsius to freeze to death. Can you imagine? So I don't really have time for doom and gloom theories. I just have to do what needs to be done, as all of us have an obligation to do, to fight to ensure that people can live with dignity and human rights. That's all my motion proposes to do. I'm not offering anything new. We have guaranteed livable, or we have guaranteed income programs in Canada already. I am not offering up brilliant new ideas. What I'm saying is that we need to make them livable. We need to expand them out for people who do not fit in our social safety net. And it needs to be in addition to current and future government programs and supports. I am not offering something that is not already in place in our social safety net. What I'm calling out is the inadequacy. What I'm calling out is the fact that seniors are having to use food banks in our community. Students are riddled with debt and living in poverty trying to get an education. We have seen disabled peoples in this country rising, saying, we are tired of having our minimum human rights violated, housing, food security, even around mobility, to be able to get around the city in winter, where we still aren't at a point where we respect people enough to know that we always have to have the sidewalks clean so that people aren't isolated in their homes. Indigenous people and BIPOC people, where you look at rates of poverty that are the highest, and in a riding that is the third poorest riding in this country, where children are living in poverty, I have zero tolerance for piecemeal approaches. I am offering, along with thousands of people in Basic Income Manitoba and Basic Income Canada, thousands and thousands and thousands of people, if you want to talk about momentum, an option to our income guarantees that are currently in place in this Canada to ensure that everybody can live with human rights and dignity. That is all I'm proposing. So I think if you want change, then you have to imagine a world outside of the confines of the system that was designed to keep people down. So I say rise. And I always have, even in the House of Commons, that picture behind me. Because time anybody tells me it cannot be done, I say, we the resilient, and we will rise. So I'm inviting you to rise to ensure human rights and dignity for all. Thank you.
Well, that is a wonderful message for us Christians heading into Easter. we have, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you for everyone for your questions. I'm honored and humbled to have been a part of this, and look forward to further conversations and actions and opportunities. This video will continue to be available at the link, the YouTube link that's on the event page. Perhaps I'll put some more information up there in the coming week that can help continue the conversation. So with that again, thank you, John Clark, Leah Gazan, and thank you for all coming, and all the best in your continued work, and as we head towards Easter and we look to rise up. So all the best.